Katy Gallagher is a Labor senator for the ACT and manager of opposition business in the Senate, and Tim Wilson is the Liberal member for the Melbourne seat of Goldstein. They both joined me earlier to discuss the week in politics. Katy Gallagher, Tim Wilson, thanks so much for joining us on Lateline. The Prime Minister made two big plays this week on energy, one on gas, one on the Snowies 2.0. Katy Gallagher, first to you, is it enough to address the energy crisis that we have at this time?
Well, we would certainly argue that it's not. I mean, the announcements from the Prime Minister today, this week, have really been about him playing catch-up on what has been a looming crisis for some time now. The Snowy Hydro one is largely a scoping study into a project that might go ahead. And, you know, I think when we've looked at this issue, we've seen the division, the disunity in the coalition party room. The big problem we face is a complete void of national energy policy, and that's affecting investment, it's affecting decisions, and now we're seeing it play out in people's homes, both in prices and in terms of, you know, shortage of supply at times. So it's, while we'll support elements of it, and certainly the scoping study into Snowy Hydro going ahead, you know, that's a project that may deliver if it gets up. I presume there'll be a cost-benefit analysis in 4 to 7 years' time. We're saying more needs to be done now.
Tim Wilson, does more need to be done now? Because, as Katy pointed out, the Snowies in particular, it's 4 to 7 years away.
Well, we're doing exactly what we need to be doing now, which is making sure that we are leading toward investments which are going to try and attempt to, or going to keep electricity prices low, because what the interests, or what the problem the federal government has inherited is the failings of state governments who have constantly tried to find ways to focus obsessively on trying to reduce CO2 emissions without any proper focus on what the market needs and investors need to invest in the technology and the electricity generation to feed the national grid.
We have heard that a lot, though, about the states being to blame. What is the federal government doing to help them, though, at this point? Should they?
Well, you've heard a lot about it, David, because it's true. And what we've had is a situation where states have...
But can you just address the question, which is what is or what should the federal government do, if anything, do you think, to help the states? They're in a bind.
Well, the states have to help themselves because we can't override state legislation. We operate in a federation. What we need the states to do is recognise reality, which is you can't just keep increasing renewable energy targets like South Australia has done. You can't keep increasing renewable energy targets as federal Labor would do, because all it does is create problems in the marketplace. What we're doing is actually showing leadership and actually focusing on how we can get renewable energy infrastructure working, and that's what the Snowy Hydro scheme is about, but also dealing with the existing challenges we have today, which is what focus on things like gas and other types of technologies do.
Katy Gallagher, you can address those points that Tim's made, but I wanted to ask you, do you think, looking back, that privatisation of many of these assets was a mistake?
Well, look, I think there's certainly, it requires further examination to have a look at that. I think there's enough evidence to say, particularly if you look at the experience in South Australia, where the national energy market has failed customers at the end, those that have been lost power or you know, suffered that disruption. But I would say that, you know, time and time again in this discussion, we have the federal government, and Tim's just done it now, blaming the states, where the states have had to move and had to respond in the absence of any national leadership. And I think we saw that with some of the frustration we saw in South Australia this week. But I saw it when I was Chief Minister of the ACT. I mean, you know, if the federal government is not going to do anything or is going to argue about energy policy internally for so long that they do nothing, the states on the ground have to act, and have to act in the long-term best interests of their communities, and that has been a lot to do with the state-based schemes that have been up and operational. But many of the state leaders, and I've heard them time and time again, have been pleading with the federal government to actually put in place a national energy framework, a policy, something that sets the direction so that appropriate investments can be made. Renewables are part of that story. They are part of that story, but allow that investment to be made to enjoy
the blame game. I want to play you again. Everyone has seen it, but just a quick snippet of what happened yesterday in South Australia.
Why did the system here allow them to generate 41%, 42% of its power from wind and solar without the necessary backup.
It is a disgrace the way in which your government has treated our state. It is the most anti-South Australian government we have seen from a Commonwealth government in living memory.
Tim, this is exactly the sort of thing that drives people away from politics at the moment, isn't it? A very serious issue, and two of the leaders unable to have a civil discussion about it.
Well, as you know, David, I'm a big fan of civil discussion, but in order to deal with a problem, you actually have to identify the cause of the problem and where it has come from so that we can try and find pathways through resolution. The problems have been created by the states because what they have done is they have shown leadership in one sense. They've shown the wrong type of leadership. They've gone out there and made a series of policy commitments and ideas and commitments to the market that they then can't deliver on, or has created problems where it's created perverse incentives, so we get the types of investment that we don't need as part of the full package. So relying too much on wind power, for instance, then creates instability in the market. And this is the consequence we're experiencing right now.
Going back to Josh Frydenberg and Jay Weatherall, a Galaxy poll overnight has shown, or at least asked the question, who's to blame for the blackouts? People said 39% Jay Weatherall, 10% Malcolm Turnbull. Did Jay Weatherall, do you think, go into that press conference spoiling for a fight?
Well, look, I know Jay pretty well over the years, and he's a very genuine leader. And I think what you saw in that press conference was sheer frustration over months of finger-pointing and accusations by the federal government, levelling all the blame around the blackout, the initial blackout, the one that has found to be caused largely by storm and storm damage at the Labor Party in South Australia. And I think you saw the frustration coming out of Jay Weatherall. He was standing up for his state. He's the one that has to respond on the ground. And I think a genuine pleading to work with the federal government to deliver in the best interest, not just of South Australia, but the nation. And I mean, I've heard him say that time and time again. If there is a good idea, I will support it because it's right for the nation's interests. But the finger pointing, the coming down, the baseless allegations being levelled at the Labor Party to make a political point, well, that's not going to solve a national energy policy void for anybody, and it's going to harm the country ultimately. And I think if I was in his shoes, my frustration would have been showing too.
Okay, a few other topics I want to get to. One of them, housing affordability, and it seems like a few options are back on the table. One of them is allowing people to raid their superannuation to buy a house. Tim Wilson, what do you think of that?
Well, firstly, I think we always have to have options on the table, and it's good to hear that there are reports and discussions not just about this idea but many others. As people may be aware, Scott Morrison has gone and looked at overseas options and what may or may not be adaptable to the Australian market. But we also have to tread with caution, because in the end what we don't want to do is have policies that lead to increases in prices into the future and don't deal with the fundamental problems, particularly around what's driving.
Is this one of those policies?
Well, it's one that has to be considered, and that's the fundamental reality. We've got to look at the consequences of it, not just in terms of people's superannuation, but also what is to be considered in terms of the effect it'll have on house prices, and particularly how much it will help people get into the market. What we know is that when people retire, they often use their superannuation to pay off the legacy of debt related to their mortgage. Now, would it be better and would it be more beneficial for people to be able to use their super younger to get into the market so they'll be able to use that time to pay off their house? That is exactly what the federal government is looking at, and exactly why it's looking at it, to make housing more accessible for younger Australians.
Well, 2 years ago, the Prime Minister himself said, "My own view is that it would be a thoroughly bad idea." Katy Gallagher, what's your view of this proposal?
Well, it's a very bad one, and it shouldn't be even being considered or, in my view, being talked about. Superannuation is there for a reason. It's compulsory savings to allow a dignified retirement. I think this again, we just explored this in the energy policy void. What we've seen over the last 4 years is we've got no housing minister federally. We've got no housing affordability policy. Nothing has been done in the last 3.5 years to deal with this looming
Michael
crisis.
Sukkar has responsibility for housing affordability now.
Well, I asked in estimates who has responsibility for housing affordability, and it got pinged back between the Prime Minister, the Treasurer. Ultimately, we were told it was the Treasurer's portfolio to manage, but we've had no specific Minister for Housing for the last 3.5 years. We've had no discussions or discussions break down with the states over the National Housing Affordability Agreement, and we've had no genuine discussion, or, well, we've had some discussion around negative gearing capital gains tax, but then it got on the table, off the table, and then we have these half-thought through, I don't know, half-baked ideas around young people ransacking their super, probably take all of their super savings in order to pay for a deposit on a house, and leave them without their savings balance for their retirement,
Okay,
and
we've
inflate
got a
housing
few more
prices.
topics
I
to
mean,
whip through.
what a joke.
No, but the real joke, David, in this is that
Just
we
very
actually
briefly, Tim
we
Wilson.
need to show leadership, and that's exactly what we're doing in the energy space and the housing affordability space. And one of the ways you actually do that is to consider options and to actually look at a package and responsibility to drive forward rather than ruling things out as Katie's doing just because it doesn't suit her political narrative.
Well, this week the new ACTU boss Sally McManus offered a gift to the government with this comment on 7:30.
Yeah, I believe in the rule of law where the law is fair, when the law is right, but when it's unjust, I don't think there's a problem with breaking it.
Katy Gallagher, some of your colleagues defended those comments, pointing to similar quotes from Martin Luther King on unjust laws. What's your view?
Well, my view is if there's an unjust law, you change the law and you organise around that. I don't support breaking the law, but I do understand the context, and I watched that interview with Sally McManus. I have a lot of respect for her. She's been a very strong union leader, a very strong female union leader for many years, particularly for low income and disadvantaged workers across Australia, and I don't doubt her commitment to fighting the fight in their interests. But for me, from my view, I would put my energy into changing those laws, which I know is something that she will also be doing.
Tim Wilson, just very briefly.
Well, I think it's extremely disappointing to see somebody in such a position of influence saying that they find grounds to break the law. When it comes down to it, she is not Martin Luther King. Our laws are designed by parliaments and they should be respected. And as parliamentarians, we should be calling people to respect the laws. And if they disagree with them, the way to deal with it is through our representative democracy. And what I'd like to see is more, particularly Labor parliamentarians, because the ACTU is the sort of organisational arm of the Labor Party, actually stand up and call this type of behaviour out. And this is exactly the type of thing that the Australian Building Construction Commission is designed to target, to try and restore some law and order, particularly in the building industry, rather than being led by rogue union leaders.
OK, we're almost out of time. My moment of the week this week was the Johnny Depp-esque apology from Coopers. Take a look.
Our company supports marriage equality. Offence has been taken by our recent involvement, for which we are deeply sorry. We've listened to a range of community views. We acknowledge this feedback and respect everyone's individual opinions and beliefs.
Tim Wilson, you were part of that debate. What did the furore tell you about where we're at with this divisive issue?
Well, I don't think it's a divisive issue. In fact, I think it's an issue that should bring Australians together to sit down, to have sensible conversations about the type of country we want to be, also about making sure that we can have respectful disagreement. And when it comes down to it, we need to find avenues to do that, and that's precisely what this video was designed to achieve. We do have to recognise that some people have very strong views, committed views. I'm one of them, as there are on other sides of the argument, and people sometimes get frustrated. But the important thing is to engage with tolerance and respect.
Katy Gallagher, was there any overreaction, do you think, to this video?
Oh, look, I mean, people react to things they see in different ways. I guess for me, when I looked at it, you know, I could understand Coopers needing to distance themselves. They weren't aware of how it was going to be used, as I understand it in the video, and their need to try and protect their brand, and I think that's entirely legitimate. But again, the sadder thing for me is someone who was Chief Minister when we legislated for marriage equality back in the ACT, you know, some years ago now, that this is still an issue that we haven't been able to resolve, and there's really only one person that stands in the way of that happening, and it's the Prime Minister. And, you know, Tim talks about respectful discussions and conversations being had. Well, it's a shame that that's not the approach that's been taken in the coalition party room on this, you know,
Well, that is not. There is complete respect. There are differences of opinion on this issue. There are differences of opinion in the Labor Party.
Allow
and I know
free vote,
the Labor
though,
Party
then,
likes
Tim.
to hide that and keep that
allow
secret.
free vote.
But it's
And that's
actually true. And Labor Party is even moving to a binding position after the next election. Not even they believe in a continuous free vote.
Okay.
My view has always been that we should recognise and find ways to achieve a change in law. None of that's changed. But what I don't think is helpful is finger pointing on this issue, because when there is success and achievement, it's when people work together.
We're out of time.
We could
Katy
get it done
Gallagher,
next week,
Tim
Tim. That's
Wilson,
reality.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good weekend.
Thanks very much,
David.
David.